So that brings us to the anti-PC movement, because I think I followed this after microaggressions, because I think microaggressions, particular, as like every kid talked about how like when they try to bring attention to it, this is called out. You're being too sensitive. It's just a joke. I have black friends. All these things. A lot of this like we see with white fragility, that we see across the board when it comes to like trying to confront and talk about racism and even like sexism and homophobia and things like that. And that really brings us to like the next section we're going to talk about is the anti-PC movement. And I want to just like start this section be first just because we're going to kind of dive into the history of the PC movement and talk about it as like a as more of a looking down at as a whole view of it. That being said, I know we do have one thing that I don't want to take away the fact that we all need to be working on like being better communicators and working on being able to like talk to people and call in as opposed to call out people and really work with our friends and family and taking the time. We're actually going to have a presentation after this on all different ways to like talk to people and make bridges with people and to get people to hear you. Oftentimes, I mean, if you want someone to actually hear your feedback, you need to you need to listen to them. You need to establish bridges. You need to. There's a lot of work to it. There's a lot of strategies to that. So that being said, I'm gonna put that on the side. Like we do need to work on that. And at the same time, we also need to tone police less and realize that as white people, when non-white people give us feedback, they're not on the same plane. A lot of times they've been they have experienced emotion. Imagine like a black person who's lost loved ones to police brutality, and then like white person posting Blue Lives Matter, like that black person may not, you can't expect that black person to like spend an enormous amount of time building bridges and stuff and trying to get you to see the feedback. A lot of times you just need to call the stuff out too. So, sometimes we do just need to call things out. And sometimes as white people, we need to have, thicker skins and realize that the whole world's built, our country, society's built around us, and we need to let go of this and become more uncomfortable. So that being said, so that is like, another issue that we're going to address, different tips and how to be better at, calling people in and working with people. So, so I do recognize that, at the same time, but at the same time, we need to understand the effects that the PC culture is having, on us. And so that's why we're going to kind of dive into this, a little bit of the history as well. So first of all, let's just talk about defining the political correctness. So Francesca Ramsey, the MTV host of Decoded, has this really great definition. She talks about avoiding words or behaviors that exclude or marginalize or insult groups of people who are socially disadvantaged or discriminated against. Basically, treating people with respect. It's not just about hurt feelings. It's about calling out oppressive power structures, and that's where the misunderstanding comes in. So having that, have this like, PC culture kind of like, which you need to put, it's based on just being respectful and not actually, realizing all the biases and microaggressions and things that we may do or say can, and there's effects to that. And those effects are feeding into this, these more oppressive systems that are actually doing a lot of harm to a lot of people. So a lot of this is just about making connections with our actions and to the outcomes and kind of ignoring, getting past this whole, well, I intended it, be good. We got to get past intent and start realizing the outcome of our actions. So then there's this anti-PC movement that's kind of formed that's all about, pushing them back against that, and it's a conservative movement. It's a political right movement that uses PC in order to kind of deflect the idea of political correctness or at least the idea of political correctness out of control, to kind of deflect any kind of accountability or having to deal with a lot of their racism and sexism and homophobia. So imagine this, it's like, so if someone says something that's extremely racist or sexist, and you try to call them out and say, hey man, that was like kind of sexist. Can we talk a little bit about this? this is their way to kind of escape this whole entire conversation. Instead of, defending, and trying to, talk about, whether this was sexist or whether this was racist, all they have to do now is say, oh, I'm just a victim of PC culture, or I don't listen to PC culture, or like, and then they can move on. So it's a way to kind of, one, it's like exaggerate and demonize people that are trying to challenge systems of oppression, so making them the problem. Like the problem isn't that, we have racism, it's that all these people are calling out racism in really horrific ways. And that, so Amanda Taub, she wrote this really great article for Vox about political correctness. She writes, political correctness is often used by those in positions of privilege to silence debates and raised by marginalized people, dismiss ideas that make us uncomfortable. So a lot of times, you only hear this, most of the time you only hear political correctness, as an accusation, as like a defense, like you see it a lot with Trump, when Trump would be, called out about, calling, being racist towards, Mexican judges or Mexican American judges, or being, sexist. He would immediately just say, I don't take, I don't have time for political correctness, was his like favorite phrase. And then like, the whole audience would cheer, and then they would just move on. And it's like, in that whole situation about what's, about the effects of racism, and it's just like completely ignored. And so there's a couple anti-PC false narratives that's pushed out there. One is like this, just like the idea that people are perpetuating racism and sexism are actually the real victims. They're the victims of this out of control PC culture. They're having their freedom of speech, attacked, even though like most of these people have even more freedom of speech than ever. They actually gain a lot. They get a lot of platforms by pretending to be the victim of losing their freedom of speech. So a lot of times it is a way to kind of rebrand racism and sexism and things as something as like they're the real victims, and then they really push this idea of thought control, language police. They're being silenced, and it's really important to understand, because there are a lot of groups in this country who are being silenced, but they're not the people calling political correctness. They're not people saying cancel culture. They're like transgender communities. They're Palestinians. They're immigrants of color. I mean, these people have zero voice, and they're just being they have zero voice, and they're really being put down, and dealing with a lot of stuff, and they don't have much say. But then these other people that have huge audiences and huge platforms, if anyone tries to be critical with them, they're being silenced. And then a big one is liberal elites. This idea that liberals are mainly elites, and that's important, because that narrative came with this idea that of trying to separate blue collar workers, working class folks, from these academic liberal elites, and the Democrats, with the idea that liberals are just elitists and they're out of touch. That they want all these great ideas, but they don't know how society works, because they're all living, like Tucker Carlson always says, they're all living in gated communities. They don't have to deal with the realities of their policies. It's just a way to kind of divide, people. In fact, like, if you look at, yeah, there are a lot, there are a lot of Democrats that are, out of touch and rich and but at the same time, Democrats have, are the most diverse party, especially along class and things like that. So it doesn't really, compare with what's actually happening. And then the snowflake. So this is a new one, social justice warrior, millennial kind of. It's the idea of taking like, someone that has a, legitimate concern about racism and sexism, and just demonizing them and making it, you're just too sensitive, you're spoiled, you're ungrateful, things like that. So Amanda Taub also writes, the phrase "political correct" is a way to say an issue has no value. And so, we're hearing about this, it's just like, the political right has really used, political correctness. It's a really great weapon for them to kind of silence, civil rights activism, social justice work, anti-racism work, feminist work. It's a great way, even like diversity and things like that. They're able to deflect any kind of claims to actual claims of real racism and sexism. they're able to just deflect that as with this political culture. And so if you start like diving a little bit deeper into like the history of political correctness, like there's a narrative that this came out from academic world, from the left world, from the social justice world, that they came up with this idea and they were trying to push it on everybody. And the reality is that is a completely wrong myth. The reality is before the 80s, and especially before 1990, no one really used the word political correctness. No one really. There was a few examples of like using a satire in different plays and stuff like that, but it was not a thing that was ever used. But in the 80s, there was a whole bunch of these conservative donors and conservative think tanks that they were trying to work on this way to kind of mainly to kind of like divide the working class Democrats from the academic, Democrats, and also kind of demonize multiculturalism and anti-racism work and things like that. So what they did is they came up with this concept called political correctness, and then they hired tons of writers, conservative. At first, it was conservative writers, but eventually, like as the ball was going, like more moderate and liberal writers would start to write about it. But at first, it was mainly conservative writers, and they got hired these people to write articles and books and put on movies and things about this this new threat to our society. This was called political correctness. And so just to give you kind of example, this is a Mariah Wiggle wrote for The Guardian, wrote a piece about the history of political correctness, and this is a quote from her article. Definitely read this whole article if you want to learn more. It says, if you search ProQuest, a digital database of U.S. magazines and newspapers, you find that the phrase political correct rarely appeared before 1990. That year, it appeared 700 times. In 1991, there was 2,500 instances. In 1992, it appeared more than 2,800 times. Like Indiana Jones movies, these pieces called up enemies from a melange of old wars. They compared the thought police spreading terror on university campuses to fascist Stalinists, McCarthyites, Hitler Youth, Christian fundamentalists, Maoists, and Marxists. So in all these new articles, all of a sudden, there was nothing written about political correctness, and all of a sudden, in 1991, 1990, 700, pieces came out about political correctness. Majority of them were being, conservative authors financed, by conservative donors to write these articles, and basically comparing this idea that this rising multiculturalism, this rising social justice work was all about, authoritarian, was all about controlling and suppressing, our freedom of speech and our freedoms in general. And they would cherry pick certain, things like certain, college class, professors that were like maybe had to said some really offensive things and had to deal with some harassment. Or they had some articles about like this yoga studio up in Canada that was trying to like decenter whiteness from yoga or something. So they cherry picked a few of these different things, and then they exaggerated them out of context and made them seem like this like horrendous thing was happening right now. And it was like, and to the point in 1991, like President Bush, the senior, identified PC culture. He gave a speech where he identified it as one of the biggest threats that we're facing. And that it was like, destroying our free speech and then they just ran with it, and I remember, growing up in that time and just be, all the culture. Like one of my favorite movies was, it was called PCU. It was this movie, it was a terrible movie now, looking back at it, but I loved it. It was like this bunch of white kids in this college, fraternity that just wanted to have fun and get drunk and have sex. And, but they were constantly, having to deal with all these like, activists that were, just ruining all the good times, and then just didn't know how to live life, and were just, part of this like horrible political correctness brainwashing, thing. And like, and that really like throughout like my teenager years and my early 20s, that really, for me, that put a bias on how I looked at activists. I looked at activists as these brainwashed people, for a while, and that was a direct result from all this. I didn't listen to what they were actually fighting for, and causes, and the racism and sexism and things that, like I was white male, I didn't have to, had the privilege to kind of ignore all these things, and because of this PC culture, anyone that tried to bring it up, I identified as brainwashed, and that's important, because that that was a powerful tool, once they established this idea, and then, like, like I said, and once they got, moderate and liberal writers to start picking back and writing on it, because everyone believed this was like this real, scary phenomenon that was happening. That was still to this day, it's just an enormous powerful tool that they use to avoid any kind of accusations of racism and sexism. Even, I mean, like, to this day, like, I mean, Trump, I mean, still brings up, anytime he's cornered and he's like forced to actually acknowledge, some things that he's done, that's an easy way for him to just be like, oh, I don't have time for political correctness, we're moving on, so it's let me read this last quote. Nobody ever describes themselves as political correct. The phrase is only ever an accusation. Political correctness became a term used to drum into the public imagination the idea that there were deep divide between the ordinary people and the liberal elite who sought to control the speech and thoughts of regular folk. Opposition to political correctness also became a way to rebrand racism in ways that were politically acceptable in the post-civil rights era. So a lot of this was, again, I mean, that's kind of been a pattern with the political right since the 50s, is just finding different ways to kind of rebrand the same, can't say the N-word or Jim Crow anymore, so let's say states' rights, created, in the 50s and 60s, they created racial dog whistles, illegals, law and order, to push the same, racist policies that they were. And this is kind of a continuation of this. Political correctness was another way to kind of continue to push these like same racist policies and attitudes while being the victim, being the victim of out of control political, culture. So that being said, I mean, like, I do acknowledge that, I mean, we do as a society, everyone needs to work on communicating better, and that's not our fault. Our education systems don't teach us how to actually communicate and give a sort of, feedback and have emotional awareness. So that's something that we do need to do. But I mean, it's important to understand we need to separate that need for us to communicate better away from things like political correctness as a tool for the political right, because these are two different things, and oftentimes we justify, oh, like, everyone's been called out, horribly at some point, and we use those circumstances to justify this political right, when in reality, we just need to kind of, listen, to why people are calling out. So, again, like, this is about separating those two things and realizing that political correctness was invented to basically continue to push sexism, racism, and homophobia policies while deflecting any kind of real conversations and critical conversations. It's actually a way to suppress speech. They often, people that are accused of racism will also, they'll use political correctness to say they're being suppressed, but in fact, this is a system that's actually uses to suppress the people that are dealing with the racism and the sexism, and to suppress their speech. So since the 1990s, it's definitely and then, sorry, so it's, since the, 1990s, they've added different layers to this political correctness and added different things, big one, Pat Buchanan in 1992 during the primaries, he coined the term culture war as a way, again, additional thing, when you say culture war, often, you're basically, he used it to defend, racism, sexism, and homophobia, destruction of the environment, funding art programs. He funded all these, or he used this, instead of actually talking about all these things and why they're racist, he just summarized it all up as a culture war, and then he made it, about reverse the victim and the oppressor, and all of a sudden, Christianity were the ones under attack, conservatism was under attack, morality was under attack. But in fact, no one was attacking these institutions. We were talking about, racist institutions and sexism, but the people that were actually being attacked were silenced. And then it's a way to, whenever you see someone say cultural war, it's a very nice, subtle way to just kind of whitewash the racism and sexism and make it about, some kind of like divide. It's just one side of a culture that are at war, when in reality, like, racism and sexism is not one-sided culture. These are oppressive systems that we all need to dismantle. So it is, and then, like, and then in the late 90s, it started mixing with what we call cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism So this is Pat Buchanan and, Paul Weyrich, a lot of people that are involved with the rise of the religious right. They start spreading this narrative of cultural Marxism, start combining it with PC. Cultural Marxism is this anti-Semitic narrative that that basically Jewish people are a bunch of these Jewish people from this school in Germany. I can't forget the name of it. They came over to America, and they're basically trying to destroy our culture and attack white people, trying to so this is basically the idea is that a lot of things that are happening are Jewish plots, to kind of disable our country and cause chaos. And it's basically, I'll read these two definitions. Cultural Marxism, common snare word used to paint anyone with progressive tendencies as a secret communist. The term alludes to conspiracy theory in which sinister left-wingers have infiltrated media, academia, science, and are engaged in decade-long plot to undermine Western culture. Some variants of the conspiracy allege that basically all the modern social liberalism, rock and roll, 60s counterculture, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, homosexuality, modern feminism is in fact a communist front group. It also works, also the work of Jews. So we can see this a lot, in early, civil rights periods in the 30s and 40s and 50s, especially during the Cold War, people tried to, like McCarthyism, they tried to claim that, civil rights activists were just communists, that were trying to sow, chaos in this country. And the phrase cultural Marxism refers to kind of political correctness on steroids. Right-wing ideologies, ideologues, racists, and other extremists have jazzed up political correctness and repackaged it in its most violent form as an anti-Semitic theory that identifies Jews in general and several Jewish intellectuals in particular as nefarious, communist destroyers. These supposed originators of cultural Marxism are seen as conspiratorial plotters intent on making Americans feel guilty and thus subverting their Christian culture. And this is SPC, it's a Southern Poverty Law Center. They're one of the leading organizations that follow hate groups and track hate groups in this country. So it's important to understand, so cultural Marxism, it was basically just kind of mixing this anti-Semitism into this, because people have been using anti-Semitism and anti-communism to kind of, cover up, women's rights and civil rights and things like that. And so they mixed that, with, Pat Buchanan and Paul Weyrich, mixed that with like this political correctness and kind of, as a way to kind of, basically to demonize any kind of effort, to build a better society, to fight, for, fight racism or sexism. And that's really important to understand because it seems like, maybe they weren't that successful. They're really successful. If you look at, one of the biggest, dog whistles in this country that the political right uses is Soros, George Soros. This guy, that supposedly is like the mastermind behind, Jewish plots to undermine this country. Like Trump in the political right literally convinced people that Soros was funding the migrant caravans in 2018, to bring in, dangerous immigrants into this country. And he was so successful, they inspired the largest Jewish massacre in Pittsburgh, a synagogue. Not only a synagogue, but a synagogue that was working to help relocate refugees and asylum seekers from south on the border. This is a very common, like when you see the alt-right, rallies, in Charlottesville. I mean, they're when they say we will not be replaced and all these things, I mean, a lot of that is they're talking about Jewish people. They really do believe Jewish people are trying to, do a plot to kind of subvert white culture. And so, I mean, this is really dangerous. I'm mixing this political culture, political correctness with this anti-Semitism of culture Marxism, and we're seeing a lot of violence towards Jewish people based on that. And then 9/11 hit, and PC kind of went away for a little while. We were more focused on, fighting terrorism and Islamophobia and things like that. But right when Obama comes back, we start seeing, it returns, seeing a lot of political correctness to kind of deflect, what, Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements were trying to say and what they're trying to do. So it was used to kind of demonize them, we start demonizing the whole, instead of like, they have a whole new bunch of words, like microaggressions and privilege and cultural appropriation. Like, I mean, it demonized that. So anyone using those words we're just brainwashed people trying to, brainwash others. Trigger warnings, which is so messed up because like trigger warnings is such a real thing. I know there are people that that abuse trigger warnings and probably use it for things that aren't triggered, but there are so much trauma in this country and that can be easily triggered by talking about other forms of trauma. And for them, it's just so messed up that they use that as one of the words that invokes, political correctness culture and brainwash culture. Identity politics, that was a big one after 2016. A lot of white liberals were like, we need, want class reductionists. They wanted to stop, Democrats. They thought the Democrats lost because they talked too much about race. And so a lot, but then when Trump, came back, Trump, a lot of people use stuff as like this very passive aggressive, like racism. Trump is just, openly racist, but also he uses political correctness all the time to kind of avoid any kind of real accusations for racism and sexism. Read the last quote: "The notion that Trump was both persecuted and heroic was crucial in his emotional appeal. He allowed people who were struggling economically or angry about the way society was changing to see themselves in him, battling against a rigged system that made them feel powerless and devalued. At the same time, Trump's swagger promised that they were strong and entitled to glory. They were great and would be great again." So, I mean, he used these, this idea of political correctness as this like demon, as a way to demonize all these people fighting for equality were actually the ones trying to oppress people. And the idea about being, being great again, making this country great again is kind of really centered around like silencing all these other people fighting for rights and equality. So I'm gonna play this quick video about NTV Decoded. Again, Francesca, Chelsea, PC culture.
Is PC culture destroying freedom of speech? Nope. From YouTube comments to presidential candidates, it seems a lot of people think freedom of speech is under attack. And who, might I ask, is to blame? The PC culture. If you've ever called out racism, sexism, ableism, or any other oppressivism, you've probably been accused of being too PC. PC is, of course, short for politically correct. Political correctness is avoiding words or behaviors that exclude, marginalize, or insult groups of people who are socially disadvantaged or discriminated against. Basically, treating people with respect. Now, if you ask me, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. But a recent poll by Fairleigh Dickinson University found that 68% of Americans and 81% of Republicans agreed that a big problem this country has is being politically correct. Even 62% of Democrats polled agreed that being PC was getting out of hand. For these folks, political correctness is synonymous with weakness or being overly sensitive. Similar to the new term social justice warrior, calling someone PC is a way to derail and dismiss conversations about inequality. Okay, PC police, you're just offended by everything. The term PC is almost always used as an insult. While it's been around for a while, it gained popularity in the 80s when it caught on with conservatives, not liberals. So why is being PC used as an insult? And what, if anything, does it have to do with free speech? Here's the thing. It's not just about hurt feelings. It's about calling out oppressive power structures, and that's where the misunderstanding comes in. What's perceived as being too sensitive is usually someone speaking out against lazy, offensive language that doesn't usually get challenged. That's because the group of people that those words hurt historically haven't had the opportunities to have their voices heard. And the people who call that being too PC are often in privileged positions and don't want to or haven't had to think about what they're saying or the consequences that come with it. You can't take away my freedom of speech just because you're offended. Well, yeah. In America, freedom of speech simply means the government cannot prohibit you from expressing yourself. It's why you can criticize Obama without being thrown in jail. But on an interpersonal level, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. Technically, no subject on earth is off limits. You can say whatever you want. But in turn, people are allowed to respond however they want. The fact that you can comment, means you're not being censored. If you tell a crappy sexist joke and someone says, hey, that was a crappy sexist joke, freedom of speech. And if you post some racist bullshit on Facebook and your boss decides she doesn't want to employ people who spew racist bullshit on Facebook, you still have freedom of speech. And you're free to take that racist bullshit somewhere else. America. PC culture, treating others with respect, social justice warriors, whatever you call it, isn't prohibiting anyone's freedom of speech. It's mainly about people standing up for themselves and asking to be spoken to and spoken about in a respectful way. In fact, political correctness is expanding free speech. We're adding words to the dictionary every year in an effort to promote more inclusive and respectful speech. Last year alone, the OED added microaggressions, mansplain, and a whole host of gender terms like cisgender, agender, and gender fluid to the dictionary. That seems like giving more speech to more people, not less. So have you ever been accused of being too PC? Or maybe you've been thrown in jail for saying the N-word. How do you still have internet access? Tell us about it in the comments below, and we'll see you next week right here on Decoded. In our last vlog, we asked, why does privilege make people so angry?
Okay. All right. So last part of this section, I want to talk a little bit about cancel culture, because this is kind of like the latest edition of political correctness. And I'm just going to read a couple of these quotes because I think they summarize things a lot better than I probably could. But Sarah Hagley writes, oh, part of my Zoom menu box is stopping me from seeing the top. She says the problem with this perspective is that cancel culture isn't real, at least not in the way people believe it is. Instead, it's turned into a catch all for when people in power face consequences for their actions or receive any type of criticism, something that they are not used to. So David Dennis Jr. writes, the persistence in people in the public eye to scream cancel culture and call marginalized folks too sensitive or themselves intolerant is simply a means to control narratives and live with the freedom of a misogynist, racist, or homophobe without consequences. No society isn't getting more sensitive. We're just getting more vocal and using social media as a means to articulate the need for everyone to simply do better. Cancel culture is a myth. The reality is there are more people with amplified voices who are refusing to sit silently while their communities come under attack by those with social capital to cause harm. Really like that quote. I mean, like the idea, like, I mean, because, the big thing about cancel culture, why, all those academics, wrote like a big letter saying that it's out of control is like that. Is that because we're so divided and we're so intolerant. But I mean, tolerance, if you're talking, like if this is like a new divide and tolerance was like a decade ago, tolerance was basically marginalized people not speaking up for themselves. And that's not tolerance. And this idea that we're out, we're more divided now than we ever have been, only is coming from white people in power. Because it's just, for sure. And an idea that we're getting more sensitive. No, we're just getting, people are thanks to social media and new outlets and stuff, people are actually being able to speak up for the first time. People that were silenced for so long are actually finding outlets to use their voice, and that is what's causing people that have always had a voice to say that they're being silenced. So I really like Ta-Nehisi Coates write on a really great article called "Cancellation of Colin Kaepernick." All cancellations are not created equal. Christine Blasey Ford, who accused Brett Kavanaugh at a Supreme Court confirmation hearings of sexual assault, was inundated with death threats, forced from her home and driven into hiding. Dave Chappelle, accused of transphobia, collected millions from Netflix for a series of stand-up specials, and he got his feelings hurt. That just like summarizes that, there are actual people being silenced, with that crazy death threats, going on. Colin Kaepernick lost his career, for kneeling, during, talk about being silenced, and the ramifications. But Dave Chappelle says a bunch of transphobic things that feeds into a transphobic society that is like literally killing, transgender people at some of the highest rates disproportionately than any other group. He still got to finish his Netflix series. He still made tons of money. If anything, his voice was amplified even farther because more people were hearing him. And he picked up a huge anti-PC fan base as well. So it's not the same at all. Ijeoma Alu, says cancel culture doesn't exist. All your faves still bounce back and stay trash. diminish. What does exist is the rising frustration that marginalized people feel when time and time again those who with power and influence say and do shit that harms them without any real attempts to ever make it right. And then Britt Bennett, oh yes, cancel culture, formerly known as consequences. I just think those quotes just do such a great job kind of capturing what this cancel culture is really about. And then AOC, man, I hope people just watched her last. She gave a speech in Congress about sexism and patriarchy last night, and it's just so powerful. Hopefully, everyone, please go, listen to that speech. She's such an amazing voice, and the fact that the political right, like demonize and attack her so much and try to portray her as, I think the more they do that, the more I think hopefully people realize just how important it is to have progressive people like AOC. But we'll just read a couple of things that she wrote about cancel culture. Many of the people actually canceled are those long denied a fair hearing of their ideas to begin with. Palestinian human rights advocates, abolitionists, anti-capitalists, anti-imperialists, not spicy contrarians who want to play devil's advocate with your basic rights in the New York Times. People who are actually canceled don't get their thoughts published and amplified in major outlets. This has been a public service announcement. The term cancel culture comes from entitlement, as though the person complaining has a right to a large captive audience, and one is a victim if people choose to tune them out. Odds are you're not actually canceled, you're just being challenged, held accountable, or unliked. Whoa. And the last, I'm just going to read 2 more quotes I want to read about political correctness and cancel culture on that. This person, Al, said, what they say, political correctness gone mad, what they mean, I feel uncomfortable that historically oppressed groups are calling me out for my bigotry. Why can't they just continue to take our shit and shut up? When I hear about people talking about how we're more divided than we've ever been, I just instantly think of that, what you mean. If this is your divide, then your unity has to be basically, why can't they just continue to take our shit and shut up? Like that's unity. That's when this country was great. And last one I want to read, Amanda Taub. Definitely read her article about political correctness if you want to learn more about the history. Her and the Guardian article. Trans women who protest definitions of women as people with vaginas are merely belly aching about terminology. Aren't merely belly aching about terminology. They're people on the margins of a group making legitimate demands for inclusion. Women of color who point out the many ways in which white feminists overlook issues that affect minority women aren't engaging in race-based arguments just for fun of it. They're pointing out that the feminist movement has promised to protect their interests, but was in fact ignoring them. And that's like the biggest one. Like, I think we need to understand, like, this isn't just like, they're not just like you're not just talking about race just to complain. They're not just complaining. They're legitimately trying to survive. And then for us to say that you're, and they're because they recognize that, that a lot of their oppression, a lot of their safety, a lot of their, their silence is coming from these oppressive systems. So but for us to be like, just to label them, trying to dismantle these systems that are literally killing them as like political correct or cancel culture, it's just, it's ridiculous, and we need to get past this. And again, I understand we all need to work on doing like giving feedback better, assertive communication, human, all that stuff. But and at the same time, I mean, we got to get away from this political correctness like this. We can't tolerate this stuff much longer.